My name is Angela Wilson, and I am 32 years old. On paper, my life looks put together. I run a successful graphic design studio in Chicago, have a home I'm proud of, and a circle of friends who make me feel valued. But none of that mattered the night I sat at my family's Christmas dinner and heard the words that confirmed what I had felt my entire life. We were all gathered around the table. My parents, my siblings, their spouses, and kids. The house looked exactly as it always had during the holidays, sparkling lights, carefully arranged decorations, the smell of roasted turkey filling every corner. From the outside, it looked like the perfect family gathering. On the inside, it felt like a minefield I had learned to tiptoe through year after year. The conversation flowed easily, but not in my direction. My mother asked Michael about his latest sales accounts, praising him for what sounded more like wishful exaggerations than reality. She turned to Sarah and beamed as Sarah described school events and volunteer work, hanging onto every detail as if it were pure gold. Even Julia, the youngest, had everyone's attention when she talked about her new internship. When I tried to share my own update, an article about my design studio featured in a national magazine, the room went silent for a brief moment, and then the conversation swerved right back to Sarah's children. I smiled, took a sip of wine, and reminded myself that I had expected this. It wasn't new, it was the same pattern I had lived through my entire life. But then it happened. My mother, who had been topping off wine glasses and fussing over the table, suddenly looked straight at me. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but her words cut sharper than anything she had ever said before. "You are the most useless child we have." The air left the room. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. No one moved, no one spoke. My siblings glanced down at their plates, clearly uncomfortable, but not one of them said a word. My father froze with his napkin in hand, his eyes darting between me and my mother, but he stayed silent. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't as if the thought was new. I had heard the insinuations for years, felt the comparisons, absorbed the dismissals, but hearing it spoken aloud in front of everyone at Christmas dinner felt like being stripped bare. I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had raised me, who had shaped so much of how I saw myself, was now confirming every fear I had ever had. I could feel decades of hurt pressing against my chest, every overlooked achievement, every backhanded comment, every moment of invisibility crashing together at once. And then something inside me shifted. Instead of shrinking back as I always had, I found myself pushing my chair back from the table. The legs scraped against the hardwood, the sound loud in the suffocating silence. My napkin slid to the floor, forgotten. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, but my voice, when it came, was steady. "Then stop calling me when you need money." It was like dropping a bomb in the middle of the table. My mother's face went pale, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. My father's hand froze halfway to his glass. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes. Sarah's fork hung suspended. Julia's eyes went wide, her phone forgotten in her lap. No one knew what to say, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one scrambling to smooth things over. I had finally spoken the truth, and there was no taking it back. In that moment, I wasn't just the overlooked middle child. I wasn't the quiet one who faded into the background or the daughter desperate for approval. I was someone who had finally decided to stop playing the role I had been assigned since childhood, and for the first time in 32 years, the silence belonged to them, not me. To understand why my mother's words at Christmas struck so deeply, you need to understand what it was like growing up in my family. From the outside, we looked picture perfect, 2 parents, 4 children, a comfortable suburban life in Milwaukee. Inside, the roles were assigned early and mine was clear. I was the invisible middle child. My older brother, Michael, was the star. From the moment he could throw a football, my parents built their world around him. Every Friday night was his game. Every weekend was his tournament. Trophies filled the shelves in our living room, the same room where my certificates for art competitions were quietly stacked in a drawer. I learned to keep myself entertained on the bleachers with a book while the crowd roared for him. Our parents glowed with pride every time he walked into a room. Then there was Sarah, my older sister. She was the golden daughter, the embodiment of everything my mother valued. She married young, had children early, and embraced the domestic life my mother praised above all else. Mom would gush about her cooking, her home, her family, always comparing me to her in ways that made me feel like I was missing some invisible checklist of womanhood. Sarah just made the most amazing roast for her in-laws, she'd say, during our calls, as though hinting that my dinners of takeout and late-night work sessions didn't measure up. And finally, Julia, the baby. 7 years younger than me, she was treated as if she could do no wrong. Her mistakes were brushed aside as finding herself. When she dropped out of her first college program, my parents framed it as a journey of self-discovery. When she maxed out her credit card, they quietly paid it off. Julia's place in the family was that of the adored youngest child, shielded from consequences the rest of us weren't spared. Where did that leave me? Caught in between. Not the athlete. 8. Not the homemaker, not the baby who needed protecting. Just Angela, the quiet one with her sketchbooks, filling page after page with drawings while the rest of the family revolved around each other. My grades were good, but they were never a headline. My art earned awards, but they never made it to the fridge. Even in family portraits, I seemed misplaced. One of the largest pictures in our house had my siblings posed proudly around our parents. Julia sat on Mom's lap, Michael and Sarah stood behind them, and I was off to the side as if added at the last minute. The truth is, invisibility became my survival strategy. If I stayed small, I wouldn't be criticized as much. If I kept to myself, I wouldn't risk being compared. I learned to make myself useful in the background, setting the table, washing the dishes, taking photos while the rest of the family posed together. I thought maybe if I was helpful enough, they'd notice me. But helpful and invisible became the same thing. My mother was the architect of it all. She had been raised in a strict household and carried those rigid values into our family. To her, success meant certain things: a respectable job, a conventional family, stability at any cost. She couldn't see value in creativity or independence. When I told her I wanted to study graphic design, she didn't even pretend to be supportive. "What kind of real job will you get with that?" she scoffed. Even later, when I landed internships and positions at respected firms, she dismissed them as not real work like your father's. I wish I could say my father was different, that he balanced her harshness with warmth. But while he cared in his quiet way, he rarely stood up to her. If she launched into one of her cutting comparisons, he might say, "Now, Nancy," Nancy, under his breath, but the moment she turned on him, he went silent. His support came in small, hidden gesture. A pat on the shoulder, an encouraging note slipped onto my desk. But always when my mother wasn't looking. Looking back, I realize I grew up starving for recognition, not even grand gestures, just a moment of being seen, of being acknowledged. But year after year, holiday after holiday, I played my assigned role. The quiet, responsible daughter who never caused trouble, who faded into the background, who accepted being less important than the rest. So, when my mother called me useless at that Christmas dinner, it wasn't just one cruel comment, it was the culmination of decades of invisibility. It was confirmation of the role she had written for me long before I was old enough to choose my own. And that was why this time I couldn't stay silent. As I grew older, the role my family had assigned me, quiet, unremarkable, second best, stuck to me like a shadow. But outside the walls of our home, I was building something entirely different. The irony was that the very qualities my family overlooked, my creativity, my independence, my persistence, were the ones fueling my success. After college, I dove headfirst into graphic design. It wasn't easy. My first years in the industry were brutal. I worked long nights, lived on ramen, and poured everything I had into building a portfolio that could stand out. I took freelance jobs that barely paid, said yes to opportunities others passed over, and slowly carved out a name for myself. I rented a tiny loft and turned it into both a home and an office. While my siblings leaned on my parents for support, I was fighting tooth and nail to create a life on my own terms. And it worked. By my late 20s, I had founded my own design studio, Wilson Design Works. It started small, just me and a drafting table, but grew quickly. When a regional brewery hired me to lead a full-scale rebrand, the campaign took off. Their sales soared, and suddenly my name was being mentioned in circles I had only dreamed of entering. One success led to another. Soon, I had a roster of clients ranging from regional businesses to national brands. My team grew to 7 full-time employees. My studio was earning over $500,000 in annual revenue, and I was invited to speak at design conferences across the country. Financially, I had achieved more security than I ever imagined. I bought my own condo outright, built savings, and created a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or assistance. On paper, I had everything that should have silenced the doubts my family had planted in me. But here's the cruel twist. None of it mattered to them. When I tried to share milestones, my family dismissed them. The first time I was featured in a design magazine, I brought the glossy issue home, excited to show my parents. My mother glanced at it for less than a minute before changing the subject to Michael's new sales position. The magazine was tossed aside, forgotten, before dessert was served. When I landed a contract worth more than my father's annual salary, my mother brushed it off as just drawing pictures. Even when my work directly helped pay for family needs, repairs, medical expenses, tuition, it was reframed as an obligation, not an accomplishment. The minimization wasn't subtle. My mother would say things like, "Ginkamni, your little drawing business is cute, but real success is having a family." If I shared that I'd been promoted, she'd ask why it had taken me so long. If I mentioned buying my condo, she'd remark that living alone at my age must feel lonely. Her words were never outright cruel, but they were sharp enough to cut. And it wasn't just her. My siblings played their roles too. Sarah treated my career as if it were a hobby, occasionally asking me to design invitations or flyers as though that was the extent of my skills. Michael rarely asked about my work at all, except when he needed help with money. Julia, the baby. I simply accepted the narrative. Angela was the one who stayed in her little world doing creative stuff while the real accomplishments happened elsewhere. The irony was unbearable. Outside of my family, people respected me. Clients trusted me with multi-million-dollar projects. Industry leaders invited me to speak, colleagues admired my work, friends celebrated my growth, but at home, I was still the background character, still treated like someone who hadn't quite measured up. It created a painful dissonance in me. On one side, I had built a life I was proud of, a thriving business, a loving relationship, financial independence, and meaningful friendships. On the other, I reverted to invisibility the moment I stepped into my parents' house. Every ignored achievement, every dismissive comment, every moment where I was talked over hardened into a truth I had long carried. No matter what I did, it would never be enough for them. And yet, despite all the evidence, some part of me kept hoping. Hoping for one word of praise, hoping to finally be seen, hoping that success might earn the love that had always felt just out of reach. That was the hunger I carried with me into every holiday, every dinner, every phone call. And it was exactly why my mother's words that Christmas, "You are the most useless child we have," cut so deep. Because I had done everything to prove her wrong, and she still refused to see me. For years, my family called me useless, but behind the scenes, I had quietly become the one keeping everyone afloat. What started as the occasional favor gradually turned into something far larger until I was less a daughter and more the family's unacknowledged bank account. It began innocently enough. My father's car broke down one winter, the repair bill steeper than expected. He looked embarrassed when he called me, hesitant to ask, but my mother smoothed it over. "It's just until payday," she said. I covered the bill without a second thought. He needed the car for work and I could afford it. Then Julia's tuition pay me. NTS fell short. My parents claimed money was tight, that they had stretched themselves too thin, helping all of us. I stepped in and paid half her semester. She never even knew it was me. My parents told her they had taken out a loan and I didn't correct the story. At the time, I told myself it was what families did. But over the years, the requests multiplied. Michael called me in panic about overdue bills, promising to pay me back next month with every breath. Sarah rarely asked outright, but she would complain about how expensive raising kids was until I offered to chip in for school fees or buy her children gifts that went far beyond what an aunt normally would. And my mother, she perfected the art of hinting. "The roof is leaking again," she'd sigh on the phone. Or, "Your father's prescriptions cost so much these days." She never used the words, "Can you help?" But she didn't need to. I was conditioned to step in and she knew it. Each time, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I was successful, I could afford it. But quietly, the amounts added up, 500 here, 1,000 there, then larger sums, 10,000 for Michael's near bankruptcy, 15,000 to save his house from foreclosure. By the time I turned 30, I had funneled over $100,000 into my family's problems, money they never acknowledged, let alone repaid. The most painful part wasn't even the money, it was how invisible my contributions remained. No one ever said thank you. My mother dismissed it as the least you can do after all we did raising you. To her, my financial help wasn't generosity, it was duty. My father didn't know the truth because she told him repairs or bills had been covered by savings or insurance. My siblings accepted the benefits as if they had simply fallen from the sky. I became the fixer, the dependable one. The safety net no one saw. My family leaned on me for survival, but in the same breath, they dismissed me as unimportant. My career, the very thing funding their emergencies, was belittled as drawing pictures. My stability was reframed as loneliness. My success was diminished even as they benefited from it. Over time, I realized the more I gave, the less they respected me. My silence allowed them to pretend their lives were intact, that Michael was thriving, that my parents were financially stable, that Sarah and Julia were self-sufficient. By covering for them, I wasn't just paying bills, I was helping preserve a lie. The weight of it was exhausting. Every time the phone rang, I braced myself. Would it be another hint about a medical bill, another panicked request from Michael, another carefully worded sigh from my mother? I stopped answering immediately, letting calls go to voicemail just to steel myself before hearing the next crisis. Even my closest friends could see the toll it was taking. My best friend Lisa told me bluntly one night, "You've turned yourself into their ATM. That's not love, that's exploitation." Thomas, my boyfriend, put it differently. "Why do you let them treat you like this?" he asked gently. "Why do you give and give when they can't even give you basic respect?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that some part of me still believed that if I was useful enough, if I provided enough, maybe they would finally see me, finally value me. But deep down, I also knew the truth. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. And by the time Christmas rolled around, I wasn't just carrying gifts to my parents' house, I was carrying years of resentment, unspoken truths, and a growing awareness that something had to change. The breaking point didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for months, maybe years, and Thanksgiving was the spark that set the stage for the explosion at Christmas. That Thanksgiving, I had walked into my parents' house already on edge. Before I even had my coat off, my mother looked me up and down and asked if I had given up on dating since I'd come alone again. When I explained that I was in a serious relationship with Thomas, she dismissed him instantly, just another boyfriend. She turned to Sarah and in the next breath praised her for being a wife and mother, as if those were the only roles worth admiring. Dinner was no better. I tried to share some exciting news. My studio had just signed a major client that would take us to the next level. But before I could even finish the sentence, my mother interrupted to ask Sarah about the children's school fundraiser. The conversation never circled back. Later that evening, as we washed dishes together, she leaned close and said, "It's probably for the best you focus on your little drawing business. You're not cut out for motherhood anyway." I drove home that night with a migraine, vowing I would skip Christmas altogether. I told myself I didn't need to keep putting myself in these situations, that I had nothing to prove to them. But as December crept closer, the familiar pull of guilt and hope returned. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe if I showed up, they would finally see me. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, came the call from Michael. He spoke in hushed tones like he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Angie, I hate to ask, but I'm in a tight spot. The bank's threatening foreclosure. I just need $15,000 to cover the mortgage until my commission comes through. Please don't tell Mom and Dad. They still think I'm doing great." It wasn't just the amount, though $15,000 was no small thing, even for me. It was the fact that he had already owed me tens of thousands from past emergencies he never repaid. I thought about saying no. I thought about letting him face the consequences of his choices, but when he mentioned his wife and kids, I caved. I transferred the money and sat staring at my computer screen afterwards, seething. That night, I called Lisa. She didn't mince words. "You've got to stop. They'll never respect you if you keep saving them. Let him deal with it." Thomas echoed her sentiment in a quieter way. "Maybe it's time you stop waiting for them to see your worth and start showing them you know it yourself." Those words stayed with me. By the time Christmas came, I wasn't just dreading another dinner, I was ready for something to change. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't going to sit quietly anymore. By the time Christmas Day arrived, I was wound so tightly that even the sight of my parents' house, the white lights, the wreath, the perfectly staged decorations felt like a performance I no longer wanted to play along with. Still, I gathered the carefully wrapped gifts from my trunk, straightened my dress, and walked inside. The first hour unfolded like so many others before it. Sarah's casserole got praised as if it were a 5-star meal. Michael regaled everyone with stories of his work, exaggerating his success while avoiding the truth of his financial mess. Julia barely looked up from her phone, but still managed to get more attention than me. My mother fluttered around, asking questions of everyone but me, never once pausing long enough to acknowledge the effort I had made to be there. When it was time for dinner, I noticed the seating arrangement. My mother at the head, my father at the other end, Michael and Sarah seated proudly beside them, Julia tucked in close, and me? I was placed at the farthest end of the table next to my 10-year-old nephew. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer. At first, I let the conversation flow around me. My mother leaned in with interest as Michael described his new accounts. She beamed when Sarah talked about her volunteer projects. When the spotlight shifted briefly to me, it wasn't to acknowledge my accomplishments, but to criticize. Angela, you should think about volunteering somewhere. You spend too much time alone with that computer. I cleared my throat, determined to speak up. Actually, I volunteer twice a month with a youth art program. My studio also donates design services to nonprofits. There was a pause. For a flicker of a second, I thought maybe she'd be impressed. Instead, she gave a perfunctory, "Well, that's nice, before immediately turning the spotlight back to Julia's new internship. I forced a smile, but inside something was cracking. I tried again later. My studio was featured in Design Quarterly last month, I said. They did a 4-page spread on our rebranding work for Clearwater Technologies. My mother tilted her head. Oh, is that one of those online blogs? No, I corrected, my voice firmer. It's one of the most respected print magazines in the design industry. Before I could continue, she cut me off. Speaking of achievements, Sarah, didn't Chloe make the honor roll again? The conversation swerved away, my news dismissed as irrelevant. I clenched my fork, every muscle in my body telling me to swallow it to keep playing the role I always had. But this time, the anger didn't fade. It built, dessert arrived, and Michael surprised me by speaking up. Hey, wasn't Clearwater that big software company? I think I saw their new look. That was you, right? For once, I felt seen. Yes, we redesigned their brand and user interface. It was a 6-month project. That's impressive, Angie, he said. Before I could savor it, my mother frowned. I can't imagine they paid much for just some colors and fonts. Now, who wants coffee? I set down my fork. My heart pounded, but my voice came out steady. Actually, Mom, that contract was worth over $200,000. T boosted their engagement by 40%. My business employs 7 people full-time and generates over $500,000 a year. The table went silent. My father blinked in surprise. Sarah froze with her fork in mid-air. Even Julia looked up from her phone. But my mother didn't falter. She narrowed her eyes. There's no need to exaggerate, Angela. Graphic design is barely a step above making posters for school events. Success isn't just money. At your age, you should have more to show for your life than drawings and a fancy apartment. Your sister gave us grandchildren. Your brother has a respectable career. Even Julia is finding her way. You've always been a dreamer. Her words hit me like a slap. I took a breath, and in that breath, decades of swallowed pain rose to the surface. My napkin slid from my lap as I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. Every eye turned to me. Then stop calling me when you need money. The room froze. My mother's face drained of color. My father half rose from his chair, his confusion written across his face. Michael stared at his plate. Diane gasped softly. Sarah went still. Julia's eyes welled with tears. I didn't stop. Do you want to know what useless looks like? Useless isn't the person who paid for Dad's car repairs. Useless isn't the one who covered half of Julia's tuition. Useless isn't the one who saved Michael's house from foreclosure 3 times, including $15,000 just yesterday. The room erupted in murmurs. Diane turned to Michael, her voice sharp. Is that true? You told me your boss gave you an advance. Michael muttered, Angie, you promised. No, I cut him off. I promised to keep enabling your lies, and I'm done. I turned back to my mother. My voice was shaking now, not from fear, but from release. For 5 years, you've called me at least once a month for money. The refrigerator? Me. Dad's medication? Me. The roof? Me. Over $100,000 in the last 3 years, and not once have you said thank you, not of home. And have you acknowledged that my little drawing business has been keeping this family afloat? My father's face went ashen. Angela, I didn't know. Of course you didn't, I said softly, and she never wanted you to know. No one was supposed to know the truth, that the so-called useless child is the one holding everything together. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. But for the first time in my life, it wasn't me carrying it. The silence that followed my words was suffocating. My family, who always had something to say, suddenly had nothing. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath them, the roles we'd all played for decades collapsing in an instant. My mother was the first to react. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time, I could remember she looked rattled. Her usual composure, the sharp tone, the cutting gaze, had cracked. Color drained from her face as if she had been caught completely off guard. My father sat back heavily, his napkin falling to the table. His eyes darted from me to my mother, confusion written across his face. Angela, what are you talking about? He asked, but his voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I think he already knew. Michael kept staring at his plate, jaw tight, as if avoiding eye contact would make him invisible. His wife, Diane, turned to him in disbelief. "You told me your commission was paying the mortgage. Is what she said true? Did she give you $15,000 yesterday?" He winced. "Diane, not here." Her voice sharpened. "No, Michael. Here. You lied to me. You lied to everyone." The sound of their whisper fight filled the air, but I wasn't finished. I looked around the table, my voice trembling but loud enough to cut through. "You've all taken from me, every one of you. Dad's car repairs, I paid. Julia's tuition, me. Sarah's kids' education fund, me again. Michael's house, I've poured money into it more times than I can count. And Mom, every time you needed something fixed, replaced, or covered, it was me. But I wasn't just the family ATM, I was the family's scapegoat too. The one you ignored, belittled, dismissed." Sarah finally spoke, her face pale. I didn't know. Angela, you never said anything." "Would it have mattered?" I asked, looking directly at her. "Would Mom have stopped comparing me to you? Would you have treated me with respect instead of brushing me aside?" Her eyes dropped to her lap. She didn't answer. Julia's phone lay forgotten on the table, her cheeks streaked with tears. "Did you really pay half my tuition?" she whispered. "They told me it was a second mortgage." I nodded, my anger softening for a moment. "Yes, Julia, I did, because I wanted you to have a chance." My father looked gutted. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Nancy, is this true? Have you really been asking Angela for money all these years?" My mother snapped back into form, her chin lifting defensively. "If she chose to help, that was her decision. Families help each other. She doesn't get to throw it in our faces." Her denial didn't sting the way it used to. For once, I didn't feel small in her presence. I felt free. "No, Mom, families support each other emotionally as well as financially. Families celebrate each other's successes. Families don't treat love as a transaction I gave because I cared, but you turned it into a debt I could never repay. And I'm done." The table erupted into fragments, Diane demanding answers from Michael, Sarah whispering to her husband in shock, Julia openly crying, my father sitting shell-shocked. My mother sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line, her denial intact but her authority shaken. And me? For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking into the silence. I was standing in it, owning it, unafraid of the fallout, because finally, the weight wasn't mine alone to carry. Leaving my parents' house that night felt like walking away from the wreckage of a collapsed building. My hands shook as I grabbed my bag from the guest room, the sounds of chaos still echoing downstairs. Diane was demanding answers from Michael, Julia was crying, Sarah was trying to mediate, and my mother's voice, sharp and indignant, cut through it all. For once, none of it was aimed at me. My father intercepted me in the hallway as I headed for the door. His eyes were wet, his voice breaking. "Angela, please don't leave like this. We can fix this." I placed a hand on his arm, gentler than I expected myself to be. "Dad, this can't be fixed in one night. It's been decades in the making. I need space." His face crumpled. "I didn't know," he whispered, "about the money, about how you felt." "I know," I said softly, "and that's part of the problem." He pulled me into a hug, whispering, "I'm proud of you," words I had waited my whole life to hear. Tears stung my eyes as I hugged him back. Then I walked out, closing the door behind me on the only version of family I had ever known. The drive back to Chicago was surreal. Christmas lights blurred through my tears. The world outside looked festive, joyful, untouched, while inside me everything had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore, I was hollowed out and strangely lighter. I had finally said the words I had swallowed for years. When I got home, I collapsed onto the couch, phone buzzing relentlessly in my bag, 17 missed calls, 23 texts. For a moment, I considered throwing the phone into the snow and walking away from it all. But eventually, I looked. Julia's texts came first, frantic, emotional, apologetic. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Please call me. I love you. I never saw how Mom treated you. I was so wrapped up in my own stuff." Michael had only sent 2 short messages. "We need to talk. DI. Anna is really upset. Thanks a lot. Even in the fallout, he was more worried about appearances than accountability." Sarah's messages were long, complicated. "I'm in shock. I never realized how much you were doing for everyone. Mom is beside herself. Dad took her upstairs after you left. I know we haven't been close, but I respect what you've accomplished. Honestly, I think I've been jealous of your freedom." That one stopped me. Jealous. Sarah, the golden child, the one I was constantly measured against, jealous of me? I had never considered it. There was a single text from my father. I failed you, I'm sorry, I love you. From my mother, nothing. I turned the phone off and went to bed, exhausted but strangely at peace. For the first time in years, I slept deeply. The following morning, the messages continued. Julia sent a long email, this time more thoughtful than her texts. She admitted she had looked up to me but had absorbed Mom's dismissive attitude without even realizing it. She promised to do better, to see me differently. Reading her words, I felt both grief and hope. Grief for the years lost, hope for the possibility of something new. My father's email arrived later. Longer than his text, it was a confession of sorts. He admitted he had been a coward, that he had chosen silence over conflict for too long. He wrote about his argument with my mother after I left, how for the first time he challenged her treatment of me. He ended with the words I had craved for decades. I am proud of the woman you've become. But the biggest surprise was Michael. Not in words, but in action. That afternoon, I received a bank transfer notification, $5,000. The memo line read, first repayment, more to come. It was a fraction of what he owed me, but it was the first acknowledgement he had ever made. Even as those gestures trickled in, I kept my distance. I responded selectively. To Julia, I wrote that we could talk after the holidays. To Sarah, I thanked her for her honesty, but made it clear I needed space. So. To my father, I agreed to meet him in January, just the two of us. To Michael, I sent only, received, thank you. I ignored my mother's silence. Her refusal to reach out was its own message. Through it all, Thomas stayed steady. When I called him that night, his voice was calm, soothing. You did the hardest thing, he said. Sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt. Lisa was blunter, as always. When I told her I wasn't sure if I had done the right thing, she raised her glass at our weekly dinner. About damn time. You've been carrying them for years, now they can finally carry themselves. And so, in the days and weeks that followed, I began the painful, necessary work of redefining what family meant. Not the picture-perfect version my mother insisted on, not the one where I stayed silent and invisible, but something else, messier, rawer, maybe even healthier. For the first time, I was no longer chasing their approval. For the first time, I had spoken my truth, and for the first time, I believed I could live with the consequences. In the weeks after Christmas, I found myself in uncharted territory. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't bending over backwards to maintain peace in my family. I wasn't sending money at the first hint of trouble. I wasn't swallowing my feelings to avoid conflict. Instead, I was sitting with the silence, choosing carefully when and if to respond. At first, it felt terrifying. The urge to explain myself, to smooth things over, to fix what I had broken was almost overwhelming. But with every day that passed, the urge grew weaker. In its place came something I had rarely felt in relation to my family, a sense of control. I also began therapy. Dr. Rivera specialized in family dynamics, and in our first session, she said something that stuck with me. Angela, you didn't create the dysfunction, you disrupted it. That distinction was powerful. For years, I had blamed myself. If only I had tried harder, been better, achieved more. But the truth was, the system had been broken long before I ever found the courage to call it out. Dr. Rivera helped me see that my mother exhibited classic narcissistic traits, shaping the family into roles that served her worldview. Michael was the golden son, Sarah the model daughter, Julia the baby to be protected, and me, I was the scapegoat, the one who absorbed the criticism, the comparisons, the dismissals, so the system could function without my mother ever facing herself. Recognizing that pattern gave me permission to step out of it. I couldn't change my mother, I couldn't rewrite decades of family conditioning, but I could decide what I would tolerate moving forward. So I set boundaries, real ones, not the vague promises I used to make myself after every painful holiday. I told my siblings clearly that I would no longer provide financial assistance. I wasn't cruel, but I was firm. I care about you, I told Michael when he called a week later, hinting at another temporary cash flow problem. But I'm not your safety net anymore, you'll have to figure it out. The silence on the other end of the line told me he hadn't expected me to mean it this time. With Sarah, I was more measured. She reached out to talk, clearly shaken by everything that had unfolded. For the first time, she admitted she'd benefited from being the favorite, and she wanted to rebuild our relationship on more equal footing. I told her that was possible, but only if she respected my boundaries. No more dismissive remarks about my career, no more comparisons. She agreed hesitantly, but I sensed sincerity in her voice. Julia surprised me the most. She began visiting my studio, not to ask for money, but to actually learn about my work. She asked questions, showed genuine interest, and even started considering marketing as a career path. For the first time, I felt like we were relating as adults, not as the overlooked middle child and the spoiled youngest. My father was the one who changed the most. He reached out regularly, asking to meet for coffee, coming by to see my studio, even meeting Thomas and making an effort to get to know him. In one of our conversations, he admitted something I never thought I'd hear. "I admired you all along, Angela. I just didn't know how to show it without upsetting your mother." Hearing that hurt and healed me at the same time. And then there was my mother. She remained distant, unrepentant, holding on to her narrative that I had humiliated the family. When I did see her, she kept conversations polite but frosty, never acknowledging what had been said or revealed. Dr. Rivera warned me this might never change and that I had to decide what kind of relationship I was willing to accept. For the first time, I felt strong enough to say if she couldn't respect me, I would keep my distance. Setting these boundaries wasn't easy. There were moments of guilt, doubt, and second-guessing. But each time I enforced one, I felt lighter, stronger, more myself. For years, I had thought love meant self-sacrifice, that family meant giving until there was nothing left of me. Now I was learning that love without respect wasn't love at all, and that respect had to start with me. It wasn't about cutting them out of my life. It was about redefining the terms. I wasn't the invisible middle child anymore. I wasn't the fixer, the scapegoat, the ATM. I was Angela Wilson, 32 years old, successful, independent, and finally ready to live on my own terms. Once I began enforcing boundaries, it was as if my entire world shifted. For years, I had been shrinking myself, contorting into a version of Angela my family could tolerate. Now, for the first time, I was expanding, filling my own life with choices that reflected who I truly was, not who they wanted me to be. The changes showed up everywhere. In my work, I felt more confident than ever. I no longer hesitated to charge what my designs were worth, no longer worried about whether clients saw my value. I had proof, contracts, results, recognition, and I stopped minimizing it. Speaking at conferences, teaching workshops, mentoring younger designers, I carried myself differently. I was no longer apologizing for being ambitious. I was owning it. At home, the shift was even more profound. For so long, I had measured my life by what my family thought it lacked: marriage, children, a conventional path. But in truth, I already had a life filled with richness. Thomas and I were building a partnership that wasn't flashy, but it was steady, supportive, and real. He celebrated my wins, comforted me in setbacks, and reminded me constantly that I was enough. When he proposed in the spring, there was no hesitation in my yes. Not because it would finally earn me my mother's approval, but because it was what I wanted. The freedom extended beyond relationships. I began saying yes to myself in ways I never had before. Pottery classes, hiking trips, dinners with friends, even lazy weekends where I didn't feel the need to justify my time. I discovered joy in places I had overlooked while chasing validation. My circle of friends deepened too. Without the constant drain of my family's criticism and demands, I had more energy to invest in the people who truly cared about me. Even my relationship with money transformed. For years, it had been a silent chain linking me to my family, every transfer a thread of obligation tying me back into their narrative. Once I stopped being their safety net, I felt an incredible sense of liberation. The money I earned became mine to build with, to dream with. I reinvested into my studio, upgraded equipment, expanded my team, and even set aside savings for a future home with Thomas. The same resources that once propped up dysfunction were now fueling growth, creativity, and stability. But the biggest transformation was internal. For the first time, I no longer measured my worth against my family's impossible standard. My mother had always told me success was marriage, children, respectability. I realized that was her definition, not mine. My success was independence. My success was running a thriving business, building relationships based on choice rather than duty, and creating a life I actually wanted to live. And with that realization came freedom. Freedom from the endless comparisons, freedom from the longing for approval, freedom from the idea that I had to buy my place at the table. I won't pretend it was always easy. There were moments when the old insecurities crept in. When my mother's silence stung, when Michael tried to guilt me, when Sarah slipped back into condescension, but each time I reminded myself I had already survived their disapproval. I had already proven to myself that I could live without their validation. That knowledge was my anchor. Looking back, I understood something vital. The moment I stood up at Christmas dinner and told the truth, I hadn't just spoken against my mother's insult, I had spoken for myself. For the woman who had worked tirelessly to build a business from nothing, for the daughter who had carried her family without thanks, for the middle child who had been invisible for too long. That night, I reclaimed my voice, and with it, my freedom. By the time the next Christmas rolled around, almost a year had passed since the confrontation that changed everything. In that year, my family and I had been forced into something we'd never truly practiced before: honesty. The silence, the roles, the unspoken agreements that had governed us for decades had cracked wide open, and though the pieces didn't fall back neatly, they began to rearrange into something new. When Thomas and I pulled up to my parents' house that Christmas Eve, I felt a mixture of nerves and determination. This time would be different, not because they had changed completely, but because I had. I wasn't walking into that house as the invisible middle child desperate for approval. I was walking in as a woman with boundaries, self-respect, and the power to leave if those boundaries were crossed. The atmosphere inside reflected that shift. My father greeted us warmly, embracing both me and Thomas with genuine affection. Julia rushed forward, her smile wide and unguarded, happy to see us. Even Sarah offered a tentative but sincere hug, her voice softer than I remembered. Only my mother stood slightly apart, her expression controlled, her posture rigid. She had agreed, through my father, to certain conditions for the holiday. No criticism of my career, no dismissive comments about Thomas, no comparisons. She wasn't effusive, but she was civil, and for her, civility was monumental progress. The dinner itself felt strangely different. Michael arrived later than everyone else, his demeanor noticeably subdued. Gone was the overconfident swagger he used to cover his financial failures. He hugged me quietly and whispered, "Thank you." Though for what exactly, he didn't say. His wife, Diane, gave me a small, respectful nod, a far cry from the tension of the year before. The conversation around the table flowed more evenly. Instead of my mother monopolizing it with questions for Michael and Sarah, everyone had a chance to speak. When I shared that my studio had landed another major client, there were actual questions and congratulations. When Thomas talked about his architectural projects, people listened. My mother didn't gush or beam with pride the way she did for my siblings, but she also didn't cut me off. That, in itself, was a victory. After dinner, while everyone fed to the living room for coffee and dessert, my mother surprised me. She asked if I would help her in the kitchen. I hesitated, but followed. For a few minutes, we worked in silence, putting away dishes and wrapping leftovers. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "You look well, Angela. Your business must be doing well." I blinked, caught off guard. "It is. Thank you for noticing." Another silence, then she said something I never thought I would hear. "I've been seeing someone. A therapist, your father insisted." The words hung in the air. My mother, the same woman who had mocked therapy as weakness, was admitting to seeking help. She didn't apologize outright, but she admitted she had been inflexible, that she had wanted me to follow her version of success. "My therapist says your choices aren't about me, they're about you," she said, almost begrudgingly. For her, that was the closest thing to an apology I could expect. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. When I rejoined the others in the living room, Thomas gave my hand a squeeze, silently asking how it went. I squeezed back, a wordless assurance that things were shifting, slowly but genuinely. That evening ended not in shouting or tears, but in hugs. Real ones. Promises to stay in touch that felt like they might actually be kept. The dynamic had changed, not completely, not flawlessly, but enough. Enough for me to be seen, enough for my father to stand taller, for Sarah to treat me like an equal, for Julia to look at me with admiration instead of indifference, and for Michael to confront the consequences of his choices. Even my mother, stubborn as she was, had shown the smallest cracks of self-awareness. It wasn't the family I once dreamed of, it wasn't the perfect acceptance I had begged for, but it was real, and for the first time in my life that was enough. Sitting at my condo the following Christmas. As, surrounded by my family on my terms, I finally understood something that had taken me 3 decades to learn. The battle had never really been about convincing them of my worth. It had always been about convincing myself. For years, I believed that if I gave enough, money, time, silence, obedience, they would see me. But approval that has to be bought isn't approval at all. Love that requires erasing yourself isn't love. The moment I stood up at that Christmas dinner, I didn't just reclaim my dignity from my mother's insult. I reclaimed my life. Looking around my living room that night with Thomas at my side and my siblings chatting comfortably, I realized we were building something new. Not perfect, not without tension, but healthier. A family dynamic where honesty mattered more than appearances, where respect mattered more than tradition. My mother even managed a genuine smile across the table, small but monumental. And more importantly, I had changed. I no longer needed to be the fixer, the invisible one, or the scapegoat. I was no longer starving for scraps of acknowledgement. I was whole, with or without their validation. That was the real transformation, understanding that the recognition I needed most was my own. Sometimes families won't ever give you the acceptance you crave. Sometimes they're too bound by their own flaws, expectations, or fears, but that doesn't make you less. It doesn't erase your accomplishments, your resilience, or your worth. If anything, it makes your strength more remarkable, because you built it without their applause. So, if you've ever sat at a table and felt invisible, if you've ever been dismissed by the very people who were supposed to lift you up, if you've ever been told you were useless when you knew deep down you had built something extraordinary, I want you to know this: you are not defined by their blindness. You are defined by the life you choose to build, by the boundaries you set, by the courage it takes to be yourself unapologetically. That's the lesson I carry with me every day now. And I want to leave you with a question. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who refuse to see your true worth? How did you handle it? What boundaries did you set to protect your self-respect? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about family, self-worth, and learning to stand strong in who you are. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop waiting for others to see you and finally see yourself.